Apart from the specter of polygamy or polyamorous marriages, you point out that there would be nothing to prevent two, say, straight bachelors or two sisters to declare themselves married because of the commitment that they have to one another.
Well, that's exactly right, and
without any sexual relationship.
Right. This goes back to the very first point I made a moment ago about this, which is that there is no basis for supposing that marriage is inherently a sexual relationship at all. If we've redefined marriage as simply emotional union, two sisters who care for each other, share a home, look after each other's needs, have a shared bank account, and so forth. Can have exactly the same bond at the emotional level and needs as a practical matter as people who are in a sexual partnership. Why should they be discriminated against on that understanding of marriage simply for not being in a sexual relationship or for being in a position where they can't lawfully be in a sexual relationship because of the incest laws, which again shows that in the logic of the thing, we're not talking here simply about a slippery slope argument. We're talking about in the logic of the thing, the very idea of marriage at the level of principle simply dissolves.
I want to talk over a couple of ideas that run through here, and one that you don't discuss much, but I think does come up. And the first is you repeatedly talk about marriage as a basic human good, as something that's good for its own sake, and you talk about family life as a kind of good. Is the resistance to the conjugal view a resistance to the idea that there are goods, that we can make generalizations about things that have a universally good nature about them?
There's no doubt, Ken, that at the deepest level perhaps, there has been a loss of people's understanding of non-instrumental human goods. Too often we trap ourselves into thinking that all thinking about human action and right and wrong is instrumental thinking. We fall into supposing that what ultimately matters is the satisfaction of our desires, and all reason can tell us is how to achieve the most efficient satisfaction of our desires. That's a profound error. We really need to stand fast to the idea, the belief, that there are some things that should be desired because they are intrinsically beneficial to human beings as such. They are aspects of our well-being and fulfillment, of our flourishing as human beings. We want our children to be virtuous people, not simply because they will succeed better in business someday if they're virtuous or have a reputation for being virtuous or whatever. No, we want our children to be virtuous people because we realize that virtue is its own reward, that virtue is an intrinsic aspect of our well-being as human beings, that we're better off being virtuous even if being virtuous requires us to sacrifice some things that we could get for ourselves in the practical domain if we're not virtuous. And what's true of virtue is true of so many other things. The development of our intellects, making us thoughtful people, that is valuable not simply as a means to other ends, but in itself, a robust, functioning, flourishing person will be a person who is not mindless and inattentive and silly, uncritical in his thinking, injudicious. No, a life worth really having is a life in which one is thoughtful, attentive, careful in one's thinking, judicious in one's judgment. So what's true of virtue is also true of knowledge. It's also true of our health. We want our good health not only because it will enable us to do other things well, but because health is an intrinsic aspect of our well-being and fulfillment as human beings, a basic human good. And there are others as well, the appreciation of skill and art and so forth. Those are not things that are merely instrumentally valuable. Our reason enables us to grasp them as intrinsic human goods. And the same is true of the great good of marriage. It's not simply a means to other ends, as important as its various social functions are, especially in the child-rearing area. The great insight, one finds it in the Bible, but not simply in the Bible. In Genesis 2, we find it also in the work of Plato, Aristotle, Xenophanes, Musonius Rufus, Plutarch, ancient thinkers in both Greece and Rome who were untouched by the Hebrew revelation. There's the basic insight that being in the marital bond, the bond that is oriented toward the coming to be of children, having and rearing children together, and is naturally fulfilled when that happens, is not merely instrumentally good, but is a fulfillment of ourselves as the kind of creatures we are, a basic human good, an intrinsic, constitutive aspect of our flourishing.
Well, let me bring in the other issue that you don't discuss as much, but I think I found it interesting that the quote that you cited a few minutes ago referred to the idea of freedom, because looming behind this is an understanding of freedom. I recently reread part of David Bentley Hart's book, Atheist Delusions. And at the beginning of the book, he points out that for modern culture, it's choice itself, not what we choose, that is the first good. And in reading your arguments and in reading contrary arguments, I'm haunted by this idea that the logic of the revisionist view is essentially driven by an insistence that we extend freedom as far as possible, even if it eclipses all other goods. And that there's a sense in which its momentum, I think the reason why this has happened relatively quickly is that there was a lot of built-up momentum over the course of decades and even centuries, expanding that idea of freedom and launching it so that there just wasn't enough in place to defend it. I don't want to sound too fatalistic yet,
Yeah.
but so do you think that is at stake, and that in fact, in order to rebut the revisionist view, we are going to have to challenge an understanding of freedom as the, in a sense, all eclipsing good?
The misunderstanding of freedom that you're pointing to here, Ken, is deeply connected with the misunderstanding of the human good that we talked about a moment ago. It's certainly true that many people have lost the key distinction between true freedom and license or licentiousness. For most of history, at least in the traditions that we find in our own country, Christianity and Judaism, I'm sure the same is true in Islam, people have had a basic understanding that freedom is not simply doing what you want to do, no matter what you want to do. That freedom is morally ordered, as the late Father Richard John Newhouse so beautifully put it. There's a moral order to freedom itself, that freedom does involve choosing, but badly choosing, licentiously choosing what's wrong is not freeing but rather enslaving, making us a slave to our own passions, our own desires. And this is the connection to the earlier point. How can such an idea of freedom emerge? Well, it's when we start to think of ourselves as fundamentally bundles of desire, and of our fulfillment as getting as much desire satisfaction as we can, as efficiently and as quickly as we can, and failing to understand the distinction between what we happen to desire and the desirable, between what we want as a sheer matter of feeling and what we understand to be good and therefore intelligibly and rationally wantable. Once you've got that mistake about the nature of the human good and the nature of the human person up and running, the mistake about freedom will follow as night follows day, and that's exactly what we've seen here. So people imagine that freedom requires the recognition of same-sex partnerships as marriages, and then the recognition of polyamorous relationships, and then the abolition of other norms and so forth. It's all done in the name of freedom, but it actually undermines rather than promotes